Hello, and welcome to Easy High School Physiology. This is Dave, and we embark on Module 16 today, the nervous system, Part 3. Today we get more into the nuts and bolts of the nervous system, how these messages move along various parts of the body, going to and from the brain, and the nerve cell that's involved in this. But first I'd like to detour just a little bit into the last module that we had on the nervous system. A couple of things came to mind. I found some nice pictures that I think help explain things a little better. We talked before about the thalamus area of the brain being the relay center for messages coming up through the brainstem, and as well as various parts of the brain. And here's the thalamus right here. And as you can see, these arrows indicate the thalamus is sending messages to various parts of the brain where it's appropriate to interpret that kind of sensation. Okay? So I thought that was helped to elucidate things a little better. Also, we had this picture from before, and I forgot to mention something. You remember I said if we opened up this part of the brain that we saw the taste center and the smell center. The thing that I forgot to mention is very interesting. How many of you have smelled something and instantly had a memory of something in early childhood? Just like that. Well, this is not a coincidence. The brain is set up in such a way that that does happen. The smell center, which is right here, is also very close to some long-term memory centers in the temporal lobe and sort of in the center of the brain. And it's when you smell certain things, that connection to the long-term memory is definitely there. Okay? And the third thing, you recall that we went over running a 100-meter race to show the various autonomic functions that come into play while you are running. These are all the sympathetic nervous system functions that help you not only prepare for the run or the fight or whatever you're doing, but also take you through the run or the fight or whatever you're doing. But what I kind of hinted at but didn't come out right and say so was that at the end of the run, obviously when you cross the finish line, your heart doesn't keep pounding and you don't keep breathing hard and so on. Those are all sympathetic functions. When you cross the finish line, the parasympathetic chain of the autonomic nervous system kicks in and brings all of those functions back down to normal. It takes a minute or two for that to happen. Your breathing subsides, your heart rate slows down, and all of those, your eyesight, the pupil in your eye constricts a little more, and all those things get back to normal. So again, in the autonomic nervous system, this part of it pumps things up for action, and this part of it, when the action is finished, brings things back to normal, including at the end of a foot race. Okay. Those were old things. Now we're going to move into new things, and I have, as a matter of fact, some couple vocabulary words that we can go over. And we're going to start with this one, vertebra. Okay, this is part of your backbone. These are the bones that protect your spinal cord, and each one of the bones is called a vertebra. The complete bony the column is called the vertebral column, and we'll see a picture of that in a minute. We have been talking mainly about the brain and a little bit about the spinal cord, and that's called the central nervous system. Today we're going to move into other parts of the nervous system called the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means off to the side. And indeed, we're going to look at nerves going away from the spinal cord and to various parts of the body. Messages that are usually coming up toward the brain are sensory messages, and the nerves that they follow are called sensory pathways. So we'll be talking about sensory pathways. And messages going down from the brain causing movement or secretion by glands are called motor pathways, and we'll take a look at those. We're also going to take a look at a reflex, which is something automatic, something you don't think about, and that just happens. And we're going to distinguish that from reactions, which are also something you respond to, but the brain is involved. You think about it a little bit. Okay, so those are the vocabulary words for the first part of our module. Here, as I said, is kind of a big picture. I can get that all in there. Most people would say this is the spinal cord, but actually it's not exactly right. The spinal cord is inside this. This is the vertebral column, this looking directly from behind, going from the neck down to the tailbone. All right. Each of these little bones is a vertebra, and altogether is the vertebral column. This is the same thing looking from the side. You can see it formed kind of an S shape. Okay. The purpose of the vertebral column is to protect the spinal cord, which is actually very delicate. Here we see a similar picture. The spinal cord going down from the brain. All right. We can see there are nerves going off to the side, the peripheral nerves. Here they're chopped off so we don't see them very well. Here is very clearly we see the two hemispheres of the brain, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. This would be the cerebellum right around here. And here's our spinal cord going down. Okay, so you've seen the vertebral column. Let's take a look at an individual vertebra and see what it looks like. Here it is. It's all bone. And here's the spinal cord going inside the vertebrae. Very delicate, so you got to be very careful. And this is some meninges that are covering and protecting the spinal cord, just as they do the brain. Okay. Very good. Another nice shot of a vertebra and the spinal cord coming up. This time we can see some peripheral nerves leaving the spinal cord going out to the side. Remember, peripheral means off to the side. Okay. And our last picture of a vertebra, again, shows a nice shot of the meninges. Here's the spinal cord, and we see peripheral nerves going out. The size of the nerves is easily visible. They're anywhere from about half a millimeter up to about 2 millimeters, maybe 2.5 millimeters. So they could be about the diameter of the pencil there. Okay. This is a nice shot of the peripheral nerves minus the vertebral column. So we're just looking at the spinal cord here. Nice shot of the two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. We're looking, of course, from the back. And here's the spinal cord going down and peripheral nerves going off to the side. This reminds us of arteries going off to the side from the abdominal aorta that also goes down the center of the body. So anywhere that arteries and veins go, you'll find nerves also. This is a nice shot of nerves coming off the shoulder and heading down the arm. better shot of a nerve going down the arm. We talked before about the autonomic nervous system and how it sends nerves out to various organs of the body. Here's the spinal cord, and we can see peripheral nerves coming off from the center part of the spinal cord. In other words, not from the top and not from the bottom. These are sympathetic nerves, and they go out to the various organs. For example, here's the heart, the lungs, the liver, the intestines, the pancreas, kidneys, all the way down to the sexual organs, all right, innervated by the sympathetic nerves. And remember, parasympathetic nerves try to calm things down. So here you'll find up here are the parasympathetic nerves at the top of the spinal cord and also down at the bottom, also going out to all of the various organs that we see here. Another nice picture showing autonomic control of the various organs that we've already seen. Okay. And I think this is the last picture showing on this side the sympathetic nerves sort of in the center of the spinal cord and the parasympathetic nerves at the upper and lower parts of the spinal cord. Okay. One of the major nerves in the body, perhaps you've even heard of it, it's called the vagus nerve. It originates up in the head, but it goes down through various parts of the body, as we can see here. In the picture, they usually show nerves in kind of a yellow color, so you can follow them down and see how they go to the lungs and the heart, and the stomach and the liver and so on, pancreas, and large intestines, small intestines, okay. The vagus nerve. Another shot of the vagus nerve, going down to all of these organs in the body. Okay. Again, if you become a surgeon, one of the things you need to learn is where the nerves are, because when you're cutting into somebody, you don't want to slice through a nerve, right? Not at all. So it's important to know where the arteries are, where the veins are, but also where the nerves are if you are a surgeon. Okay, now I mentioned before that when messages are sent from any part of the body up to the brain, they would go along particular nerves called sensory nerves or sensory pathways. Here we see something is happening. The part of the skin is being stimulated, and a sensory nerve is sending its message first up to the spinal cord, and then up the spinal cord, up to the brain, to the thalamus, where the thalamus sends that message to various parts of the brain to be interpreted. Once that interpretation is done, a different group of nerves will send messages down to respond to that sensation. So this would be a sensory pathway going up to the brain. And in our next picture, as you might guess, we have a motor pathway. So here the brain has decided what to do, how to respond, and a motor message has gone from the motor area up in the parietal lobe, down the spinal cord, through motor nerves, out a peripheral nerve, and out to some muscle, possibly in your hand or your finger or your foot, to move or to respond to that particular sensation. So this would be a motor pathway. I mentioned before in the vocabulary what a reflex was. We're going to go over what a reflex was. Some of you may have gone to a doctor's office and the doctor took a rubber hammer like this and hit your kneecap with a hammer, not too hard, but if you hit the knee in just the right place, the foot will kick out uncontrollably without your control. This is called the patella reflex because this part of the this bone in the knee is called the patella. So doctors do this to see if your nerves are working correctly. It's called the patella reflex. Again, the doctor will strike your knee with a rubber hammer, and your foot will kick up, showing that that this is the reflex is working. The way it happens is that obviously your sensory pathways will send a message up to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord will send a message to the brain, but before it even reaches the brain, the spinal cord sends a motor message back down to muscles in the leg to respond, to kick out that foot. So a true reflex happens without the brain in being involved. Now, about a split second after the reflex happens, the brain is informed that the reflex is happening, but the brain didn't control it. See the difference? This is a true reflex. Another example of a reflex some of you may have experienced is stepping on a tack, stepping on something on the floor because you're barefooted. Excuse me. And again, a sensory message is sent up to the spinal cord. The spinal cord instantly responds with a motor message back to the foot to lift up from the tack or the nail. And just 1 second later, the same message goes up to the brain so that the brain is aware that this is happening. But again, the brain does not control the reflex. This is a true reflex action. Now, let me give you an idea. Well, this is another example of the skin being stimulated, and maybe there's an itch or a tickle, and sensory message and a motor message goes out to the muscle to do something. Those are all reflexes because the brain is not involved. Let me give you an idea of a reaction and how that's different from a reflex. Let's say you're driving along at night, okay, and you're behind some people on the freeway, and the person in front of you puts on their brakes. So you see their tail light up red, and instantly you know that you have to put on your brake and slow down, okay? Well, that is not a reflex. That is a reaction, because when you see that person's tail lights flash on, the message goes to your brain, and your brain says, I have to put on my brakes or I'm going to smash into the person in front of me, and your brain sends a message down to your foot to go onto the brake. That's a reaction, and reactions always take time. So the time between when you see the brakes, the person's brakes in front of you, and you initiate your own brake, that's called the reaction time. Okay. So the brain must be involved in a reaction. Now, we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We see that an interesting thing about the brain is if we put electrodes on parts of the head, just like we did on the chest to hear the heart, to detect the heart, we can see electrical signals coming off of the skin from the brain. All right, this is an electroencephalogram. These are electrical signals coming from the brain, and they're usually divided into alpha, beta, delta, and gamma signals. The various signals will tell the investigator whether you're sleeping or full of action, or even sometimes if you're dreaming, if it's a sleep situation. We're not going to have time to go into detail on these today, but again, just like the heart with the EKG can give you an idea of the electrical activity of the heart, the electroencephalogram can give you an idea of the electrical activity of the brain. This is sometimes important in a condition called epilepsy, in which the electricity in the brain goes kind of haywire and causes difficulties with epileptic seizures, for example. Okay. All right, we are going to change gears quite a bit now and go into something called a nerve cell. We have been kind of putting that off for a while because it's very much nuts and bolts, but we're going to do that right now. And here's our vocabulary that we're going to take a look at that has to do with a nerve cell whose function is to send electrical messages. Our first word is neuron. This is what a nerve cell is. It's called a neuron. Dendrites, this is part of the neuron that receives a message from a previous neuron. We're going to see that these messages go from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, and the message is received by a neuron, which then sends it to another neuron. The receiving part of the neuron is called the dendrites, and the sending part of the neuron is called the axon. Sometimes the axon looks like a tail. The synapse is very, very important. Even though there's a chain of neurons, the neurons don't touch. There's a little gap between each of the neurons, and this gap is called the synapse. And this gap, researchers think, explains a lot about learning, about memory, about motivation, as well as about responses to drugs, which we are going to take a look at in a few minutes. A nerve impulse, this is the fancy word for when there's a flow of electricity along a neuron, which is like a single message going along. The messages are usually made up of lots of nerve impulses happening almost at the same time. But it has to do with electrical conduction here. The electricity going along a nerve is measured in millivolts, which is 1/1000th of a volt. So it's pretty small, but it can be detected. Neuron pool. This is a group of neurons that are in a pool or a collection, and they are connected with each other. And investigators or scientists think that this helps to explain things like learning and memory. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. Okay. So what do these neurons look like? Well, they look weird. That's for sure. Let's take a look at this neuron over here. These are all microscopic. Most of them are microscopic, but some of them are quite large. In fact, the length of some neurons is 1 meter long. In other words, goes all the way down your leg. But for the time being, let's just say that they're microscopic. So here's the cell body of the neuron. These are the dendrites. So if there were another neuron nearby, that neuron would be sending a message to this one, starting with the dendrites. Then the message would go from the dendrites down through the cell body. This is the axon. And the message would go down the axon to the end of the axon. And then the message would jump a gap right here to the next neuron, which we don't see in the picture. Okay? This would be a sensory neuron. This would be, let's see, what is it here? I forgot the order. These are just the different types of neurons. In other words, where the cell body is. Here the cell body is the end, and in these two the cell body is more in the middle. But it's the same idea. You have dendrites at one end and the axon at the other end. The message always goes down the axon, away from the neuron. Okay? Here we see 3 types of neurons. These neurons over here are sensory neurons. That's what they look like. This one over here is a motor neuron, so this would send messages down to muscles and glands. And these neurons in the middle here are interpreting neurons. In other words, they would be sort of in the parietal lobe where things are interpreted, things are made sense out of by the brain. Okay? Let's take a look at this neuron over here because it gives a real good example of the dendrites, which are accepting a message. Here's the axon, which the message is being sent down toward the next neuron, which is off the page here. And these are the called axon terminals, and the message would jump across this little gap here to the next neuron that we don't see. This yellow part of the axon is an insulating material, and I'm going to avoid the vocabulary, but it helps the electrical message go quickly, so it doesn't slow down. It's kind of like the rubber surrounding a wire, an electrical wire in your home. It insulates it. Okay. Another nice shot of a neuron. Here are the dendrites. Here's the cell body. Here's the axon. Here's the next neuron that the message is going to, from this neuron to this neuron. Now, if you can get real close here, right in this area right there and there, you can see there's a little gap right there. See that little gap? That little space? That's the synapse. All right? And when the electrical message comes down this axon, it stops at that space. It cannot jump across. But as soon as it's ready, the neuron will release a little chemical into that space, which is like to make a little bridge, and then the electricity can jump across that bridge and go to the next neuron. And these synapses are very, very important. There's always a little gap between each of the neurons. And as we can see later, this gap is going to help explain things like heroin and cocaine. Oh, by the way, here's a nice shot of the insulating material. Okay. I don't know if we can get this all in. It's a very, very big neuron, but it's got the same characteristics: cell body, dendrites, axon terminals. Okay. This is kind of a good shot showing the axon itself, and then this is the insulating material going around the axon, just like a rubber would surround an electrical cord going to your lamp. Okay. We're going to see later that when this insulating material breaks down in certain people, they get something called multiple sclerosis. Here we see a neuron very likely in the brain, and we can see many, many, many neurons coming in to exchange messages with it. Scientists think there are 85 billion neurons in the brain, and they're all interconnected, so you can see the number of possible connections that there are and why the brain is so complicated. This is a nice picture showing that, well, you can see it. This is a nerve coming off the spinal cord. But if we look inside a nerve itself, we see it's made up of hundreds of neurons, see? In the same way that a cable holding a bridge is made up of many strands of wire, all right? Okay, I think we're going to go here. Okay, we're going to take a look at where this electricity comes from that neurons have. And I'm going to start this out by showing you one of these. We've all seen a battery before. Is there electricity inside the battery? Not exactly. If we opened up this battery, we would find chemicals inside. All right? And even from middle school, you would know that all chemicals are made up of atoms. And all atoms are made up of electrons. And if you can put chemicals together in such a way that they take part in each other, they will create a tiny current of electricity, and that's how batteries work. In the same way, in our bodies, we have chemicals that are put together in such a way that they create a small current of electricity. And I want to show you just a little bit here because we're trying to avoid chemistry as much as we can, but this is a nerve body here. We call it an axon, and the electrical message actually travels down the outside of the neuron. And if you can get real close with a camera, you can see that on the outside of the outside membrane of the neuron, we have sodium atoms, and on the inside we have potassium atoms. Sodium and potassium. These are the two chemicals we need in our nervous system to create that electricity. Now, when this axon is stimulated, for example, somebody touches your skin, or you hear something, or you see something, there's some stimulation, then these atoms interact with each other in such a way to make a little current of electricity go down the outside of the neuron. And that's where electricity comes from in our body. The electricity that makes our heart work, the electricity that makes our muscles work, and the electricity that makes nerves able to send messages. You recall when we looked at in the heart module, we saw the electrocardiogram and how when the heart contracted, we could see the electrical activity going on. Well, we see the same thing when a neuron is activated. And when a neuron sends its electricity, we call it firing, just like you fire a gun. This would be the firing of a neuron. And it starts, here we see on the y-axis, the energy is in millivolts, and going across the x-axis is time. And here we can see just before a neuron fires, it's at a very low state of voltage. When it fires, it goes to a very higher state of millivolts. And when the firing is over, the neuron relaxes and goes back ready to fire again. So this little spike here shows scientists that the neuron is working in the same way that scientists can see when the heart is working and there's electrical activity in the heart. Okay. I drew this picture myself because I couldn't find a very good picture of the synapse. Here is a neuron sending its message to the next neuron over here. And you can see these are the axon terminals of this neuron, and these are the dendrites of the next neuron. And the gap between them here is called the synapse, all right? And it's this synapse that allows the electrical message to go through, because as soon as that electricity comes down here, the neurons secrete a chemical in here which acts as a bridge to go across to the next neuron, okay? Now, sometimes that chemical is heroin, and sometimes that chemical is cocaine, all right, as we're going to see. All right. I'm going to kind of leave this here in the picture because I want to show you the next picture, which was in the vocabulary. And this is, we're going to call it a neuron pool. Here's a group of neurons. I only have 4 neurons here, but if you can imagine thousands or even millions of neurons forming a connection or a chain like this, called a neuron pool. Scientists think that this explains learning, that when we learn something, that what results is neurons forming learning chains like this, so that anytime we want to access what we have learned, that neuron chain is there. Obviously, there's a connection with memory also, that we have a memory chain here of neurons. And this is the main theory behind how we learn and how memory works. But scientists are still unsure of exactly the details. They're still doing a lot of work on them. Okay, where do we go next? We're coming to the end here fairly soon, but I did want to cover some very interesting things. I'd like to go over some drugs and their actions with the nervous system. And you might have learned in school that some drugs are called stimulants and some drugs are called depressants. Stimulants, as you might guess, stimulate your body, make you a little bit more frantic, and depressants slow you down. All right. So we can see here, looking at this all upside down, caffeine, cocaine, and amphetamines are all examples of stimulants. And what scientists think happens is that in the synapse here, when you take something like cocaine, the cocaine gets in the synapse area here and causes the firing to go very fast. All right, and this is why a person under cocaine would be a little bit fast moving and kind of what am I looking for? Kind of frantic, as opposed to being relaxed. Okay. On the other hand, when you take depressant drugs, like the opiates, now the opiates all come from the opium plant, and they include heroin, morphine, codeine, oxycodone, and Vicodin. Oxycodone is the opiate that we've heard in the news in the last couple of years, causing the big opiate crisis of people dying from overdosing on opiates. It's oxycodone. And getting back to the synapse here, when the depressant drugs are introduced into the synapse here, they slow things down. All right, just the opposite of the stimulants. If they slow things down too much, you stop breathing. So you got to be careful about that. Now, there's a drug called dopamine. Sorry, not a drug. There's a chemical called dopamine, which the body makes. And perhaps you've heard of it. And the dopamine is released into the synapse area, just like these drugs are. And what the dopamine allows to happen is pleasurable feelings of reaching a goal. For example, if you're hungry and you have a cake in front of you and you're thinking about eating the cake and tasting it and getting the benefit from it, then this dopamine is going to flood your parts of your nervous system in preparation for eating that cake, and you're going to feel very pleasant. One of the effects of dopamine. Also, dopamine affects decision making, motor control, motivation, and of course, sexual arousal. I don't know why they always put sexual arousal last, but they do in the books, okay? All right. There's another interesting chemical. These are kind of like hormones, by the way. And It's called serotonin. You might have heard of that chemical. It also is released by the nervous system into the synapse area of neurons, okay? And they allow a great feeling of well-being, but it also affects your mood, your sleep, digestion, healing of wounds, blood clotting, and there it is again, sexual desire, okay? So all of these effects of chemicals play out in that area called the synapse, the gap between the neurons. Okay. I'd like to go over a few of the diseases or conditions affecting the nervous system. The first one we're going to talk about is stroke. As you know, there are blood vessels in the brain, including arteries, and if those arteries ever become clogged up so that the blood can't get through to parts of the brain, then that distant part of the brain dies because it's not getting oxygen, right? So a stroke is kind of a heart attack of the brain. And usually what happens, it'll affect either a sensory area or a motor area. If it affects a sensory area, then there's certain parts of the body you can't feel things, maybe the skin or your lips or your feet or something like that. If it's a motor area, then usually you become paralyzed in that area. And as you recall, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So if you have a stroke and you can't move your right arm, where would the problem be? In the left side of your brain, okay? Unfortunately, stroke is one of the big ways people die when they get older. Heart attack, cancer, and stroke are still the big three killers of people when they get old. Parkinson's disease is also a disease that attacks the nervous system, and it results in shaking, feeling stiff, losing your balance and coordination. This is usually something that affects the brain stem, sometimes causing the person to tremble, or tremors. Epilepsy is a malfunction of the electricity in the brain. It just doesn't work right, and one of the effects of epilepsy is it causes seizures. Okay, most epileptics can be helped and controlled through medication, though, so this is very good. Multiple sclerosis, as I mentioned before, is a deterioration of the insulating material around the axon of the neuron, and it results in multiple sclerosis in a tingling feeling, fatigue, vision problems, muscle spasms, in problems in thinking and planning ahead. Okay. Alzheimer's disease is probably something you've heard about. This is a deterioration of the memory centers in the brain, and resulting in lack of memory, inability to think and plan, and sometimes confusion. Okay. So, just some examples of diseases and conditions affecting the nervous system. The last, here we are, finally at the end. The last topic I'd like to go over with you is mainly for you viewers who enjoy science a lot, and I kind of saved this for the end here. It's mainly a lot of numbers and descriptions of sizes and amounts. For example, the brain, the volume of the brain, if you were interested, is 1,300 milliliters, or about 1 1/3 liters. The weight of the brain is about 1.5 kilograms or 3 pounds. I think I mentioned before there's about 85 billion neurons in the brain, all connected with each other. The neuron size, the cell body, is about 100 microns across, which is 1/10 of a millimeter. If you're very good eyesight, you should be able to see the cell body of a neuron. The cell length can be up to a meter long. Now, usually they're more like centimeters long, but there are a couple of neurons, single neurons, that go all the way down your leg. The speed of nerve impulses can be up to 100 meters a second. So if you can imagine running a 100-meter race and you complete it in 1 second, that's how fast your nerves can fire along a neuron. Nerve impulse frequency, in other words, how often that firing occurs, can be between 1 and 100 times a second. Remember, hertz means how many cycles or how many times things happen in a second. I said that. And the last one here, the size of peripheral nerves, I might have mentioned that before, somewhere between 6 and 10 millimeters. So definitely we can see those. They are not microscopic, and they will, of course, be parallel to the blood vessels, which are also going throughout the body. So with that, I'm going to wrap up our coverage of the nervous system. I hope you've enjoyed it. It is a very complicated part of the body, and I've just sort of scratched the surface, and I hope that when you take more advanced courses, you're able to learn much more about it. I just want to mention our next module is going to be about diseases and immunity, and I think you'll enjoy that very much. I hope you'll come back and see us then. This is Dave saying goodbye.